Welcome to SchneiderB FM. This is the podcast to help you use the internet to market your school in order to achieve your enrollment goals. I'm your host, Brendan Schneider. Welcome to episode 21, where our guest today is Jason Schwartzberg. Jason wears many hats, which you'll hear, but the hat he wears on today's show is as the host of his own podcast, the McDonogh Works Podcast. You see, Jason is an alum of the McDonogh School, located just outside of Baltimore. He's also the president of their Alumni Association, and he hosts a podcast where he interviews other alumni of McDonogh. He gets their stories, life lessons. He asks a lot of great questions, and it's really good content. I was super interested in this idea, and I knew I had to share it with you. You're really going to enjoy this conversation. But before we hear from Jason, let's hear a word from our sponsor. Do you want to know the secret to creating the best private school website? The truth is, website redesigns don't have to be long, arduous, can't wait until it's over projects. The secret to avoiding the mess? Planning. Blackbaud K-12 has some interesting ideas on improving the school website redesign process. Whether your school is looking to redesign this year or in 3 years, their new ebook, How to Design the Best Private School Website, will help you plan ahead. Please download your free copy today at my special link, SchneiderB.com/Blackbaud. Hi, Jason. Welcome to the show. Could you introduce yourself for people who might not know you?
Sure. My name is Jason Schwartzberg, calling in today from Baltimore, Maryland. I own an energy company where we're really focused on reducing operating expenses for commercial real estate owners. I am proud father of 2 children and a beautiful wife, but I think the hat I'm wearing today is I am the president of the Alumni Association for McDonogh School, which is a private school based in Baltimore, Maryland, founded in 1873, and we are doing a podcast. So I think that's the topic of today's discussion.
It is the topic of today's discussion, and I love what you're doing and found it and wanted to share it with the community. So the big question starting out is, how did the podcast come about?
Yeah, great question. McDonogh is kind of, for the listeners who don't know the school, they're always on the forefront, right? So it's a tremendous college preparatory school. It's on 800 acres. They have tremendous faculty, facilities, resources. They recently, believe it or not, built an innovation center on campus. So always looking forward. They have a program at McDonogh called Life Ready and an extension of Life Ready, which is called McDonogh Works. And the thought process behind McDonogh Works is it's a career credentialing program for current students, parents, and alumni to, kind of scratch an itch, right? If you're interested in business development or interested in coding or interested in a litany of different topics, they have, alumni and friends of the school that, will teach a one-night course or a multi-week course to give, interested parties immersion in a particular topic. So the head of innovation at McDonogh had asked me if I might be interested in teaching a course on entrepreneurship. And while I was very interested at the time, my daughter was young, I was in a program with Goldman Sachs and running a company. I just didn't have the time to devote to teaching a full course. And I thought there might be others who were in similar situations that either, from pressed for time or geographically constrained, might have interesting stories to share and interesting lessons learned, that a podcast format might be a better fit, where the community was still getting the benefit, but it was fitting within the constraints that we all have with life. So I mentioned the idea to the head of innovation, Kevin Costa, and he's great. He said, let's do it. So it was probably a longer answer than what you were looking for, but that was the jumping off point for the podcast.
No, that's fantastic. And just as a reminder, if you're listening right now, that I'll have links to all of this in the show notes so that you can check this out. We're also going to link to some episodes, which I think you'll really enjoy hearing. Again, so we've established you're not an employee of McDonogh, you're an alumnus. So the connection was to teach the class. It wasn't because you were president of the Alumni Association. Did that come just like chicken or the egg? Was that first or second, or did it matter?
Yeah. So I'm not a big title guy. I don't think that was even part of the conversation at first. It was more of, there's interest, there's a need, how do we remove as many barriers as possible to cast as wide a net as possible, because there's people with interesting experiencing and interesting lessons learned. I think ongoing, there's some great synergies, right, between, re-engaging folks with the school and, maybe approaching them in a different manner as opposed to just kind of philanthropy. There might be some really good options to, re-engage them and refamiliarize them to what McDonogh's like in 2019 now. For me, this is my 20-year anniversary, my 20-year reunion. So there's probably some folks who are in my class who haven't been back to campus for 20 years.
Yeah.
So how can we re-engage them through a podcast format? So I think we haven't scratched the surface there yet, but I think there's some great synergies.
Now, and when you return to campus for your 20th, you're going to be the podcast guy. You'll be famous.
We'll see.
That's great. So you've talked a little bit about kind of the background and I think some of the goals of the podcast. Were there any other additional goals worth sharing?
It's kind of just really lessons learned and experience. I think we all have a tremendous opportunity to learn from one another, whether it's, I'd say there's a couple of consistent themes, right? Because it is related to McDonogh. What was your McDonogh experience? What were you into? What did the college selection process look like? What did you ultimately major in and focus in college? And then moving on to the career, right? Like what was entry into the workforce? What are you doing now? Are there synergies between your college studies and your current career? And then we usually kind of end with, non-negotiables, core values, lessons learned. And that's kind of the natural cadence of the conversations that we have.
Okay. And again, I'm going to encourage people to listen to them because one of the things, the couple shows that I listen to, you touched on, Jason, people get pretty open. They're pretty frank what they share. And you suggested an episode, which I'll link to, specifically when you said it got pretty raw, which I think is fabulous for people to hear.
I mean, it's life, right? I mean, we can keep brushing stuff under the rug, or if we all have the opportunity to learn from each other. So Lord knows we've all made mistakes. How can the greater population learn from some of the mistakes that we might have made, or some of the achievements that we might have had.
Yeah, great. How has the response been from alumni?
It's been great from a guest standpoint. If you really look at it, there's probably a couple of things that we're all collectively passionate about, no matter what our interests are. It's, kind of hopefully, family, hobbies, religion, perhaps, and your alma mater. So the response I haven't, knock on wood, I haven't received a no. When asked to feature a guest, maybe the timing hasn't been ideal. So I've been encouraged to check back later, but I haven't received a no. So that's been a lot of fun just to kind of have conversations with folks doing different things, and they're actively interested and engaged and wanting to help.
Now, maybe this isn't a question for you, but I'll just ask, has the podcast been used in other ways besides connecting alums? Do you guys use it for admissions or purposes like that?
Yeah, so to date, it's really been kind of this MVP, right? Like minimal viable project.
Yeah.
We had the idea, we've tested it a bit, and now I think it's really focused on building a catalog, having a known and repeatable release pattern. Our intentions moving into 19 are to release every other Monday. So I think you really need to have a library and have worked the kinks out, and then I think there's the opportunity to get a little bit more intentional with the mediums in which this is used.
Okay. Now, you talked about not getting a no yet from a guest. How do you find the guests?
So McDonogh, again, is pretty forward. They have an app. So there's an alumni app or directory that lists the alumni. And I started with a core group of folks that I thought might have interesting stories. And then when you have a conversation with one, if it goes, the way everybody hoped it would go, then, is there anybody else you think I should speak to? Okay. So just kind of traditional business development, putting on my daytime hat, but it's just kind of looking for interesting stories. Have had some conversations with the alumni office at McDonogh to see if they could point me in a specific direction, but I definitely haven't had any issues finding great stories to tell.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about your process for or of producing the podcast?
I mean, we keep it very conversational and we don't do much editing. I think the intent is almost just like coffee and conversation, whether I'm in person or remote. I think we just keep the conversation very organic and we don't do much editing. We've engaged the students on campus for the intro and the outro, but to date, we have not done much editing to the podcast. So kind of what you hear is what we take.
That's great. And then how long does it take you to create one episode?
So I'm fortunate. I really focus on landing the guest and having the conversation. And then the students, we've engaged the students as well as Kevin, who I mentioned earlier. They do the bulk of pulling it together, putting the intro and the outro on. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention him. A gentleman named Dave Radford at the school is kind of a jack of all trades who, does film, he does photograph, he does social. So he's been an integral part of the process. But I would say, this is not as difficult as people might think, especially if you keep the conversation organic and focus on, just getting the podcast out as opposed to, ensuring that they're perfect.
Yeah, it doesn't have to sound like NPR. If the content's good, people will listen. Any tips or tricks or lessons that you've learned that you can share?
I think you got to start. I mean, yeah. you can figure out a million different ways why not to do something. And I think that's, with anything in life. I think, I was mentioning to someone when we started the podcast, there's an app called Tape-A-Call. I think it's $10 for the year. That was how I recorded the first couple of episodes. I bought the app, super user friendly, and, we just started exploring. I'll never forget, I have never done a podcast before, and it was part of my growth. I was using a lot of filler words when we started, and I probably said the word incredible like 100 times. And my son was running around the house calling me Mr. Incredible. So I've tried to, get a little better and iterate, but I think you just got to start. If it's something that you're interested in doing, doing it with someone that you can trust, who is a good representation of the institution, and just start.
Yeah, I was going to ask if people don't have a Jason, what's the best way to find somebody because I'm sure schools are going to find this intriguing. They're going to listen to the shows. They're really, really good, but they don't have Jason. So I guess they're going to have to find you somehow.
Yeah, I don't think the magic happens because of me by any means. I think it's just finding a dynamic personality within the organization. I mean, all of these schools have fantastic faculty, staff, alumni. I think it's finding the right person with the interest. And like I said, Jason might start the podcast, and 5 years from now, they might have someone who's way better than Jason running the podcast. But I think it's kind of just start. I mean, you can iterate along the way.
It's great advice. You had mentioned, it started as really, this is an MVP, a minimum viable product. Where do you want to take this? What are your dreams with this?
It's a great question. I think I just want to keep producing good stories and good content and improve listenership and hopefully, make connections. That's really the goal is, a recent interview I just did is a phenomenal woman who graduated, I believe in the early 90s. She is an executive producer at NBC. She has a great story of how she worked her way through the process. So a win in my book would be a student who has interest in getting into that industry, reaching out and say, hey, I heard you on the podcast. I'd like to strike up a conversation. And what would you recommend that I major in college? And what are the internship opportunities? And I mean, gosh, hopefully when someone's looking for the right job, when they start out of school, if they've followed the path, maybe they land their first job. So that would be success to me, is, just being a conduit between existing students or alumni to encourage conversation and see how they both might mutually benefit from having the conversation.
Jason, that's great. Where's the best place for listeners to find you?
McDonogh.org. We have a McDonogh Works page on the website, and all the podcasts are listed there that we've released. We're also working towards being in the the podcast store on iTunes, so that we can have the push feed when we release a new episode. So that should happen over the next couple of weeks. But McDonogh.org, McDonogh Works. And then we also are on SoundCloud, and we'll be hosting on the Apple podcast as well.
Great. I'll make sure to include those links. And then if this is published and the iTunes feed isn't out, when it is, I'll make sure that it's there. Jason, thanks very much and good luck. And we can't wait to hear your future episodes.
Well, thanks for the time.
Thank you for listening. But before you go, can I ask a favor? I would love for you to leave an honest review of this show on iTunes. Reviews are the way that more people can find the show and we can get the word out and we can help more people market their school. I've made it easy for you, so if you go to SchneiderB.com/iTunes, it'll take you right where you need to leave the review. So thanks very much, and until next episode.